A lonely police officer handed over a crumpled $100 bill for a dog locked in a rusted iron cage. It was the last booth at a rundown fair on the outskirts of Texas. People walked past without stopping, muttering words like crazy and lost cause. Inside the cage crouched a German shepherd skin clinging to bone, fur matted with dirt, eyes filled with fury. It growled at everyone. Everyone but him. The owner chuckled cruelly. $100 and he's yours, if he doesn't rip your hand off first. But the officer didn't see a beast. He saw a soul, shivering, silent, defeated. When he knelt beside the cage, the dog didn't bark. It whimpered, and in that trembling sound was the truth. This dog wasn't mean. He was broken. What happened next will restore your faith in second chances, in healing, and in the quiet miracles only love can bring. The late afternoon sun sagged low over the outskirts of Amarillo, Texas, staining the dusty horizon in copper and smoke. The fairground was a shabby place, little more than a sprawl of tents, crooked stalls, and wagon wheels sinking into dirt that hadn't seen rain for weeks. Heat shimmered off rusted metal, while the smell of fried dough and sweat clung thick to the air. It was the kind of place where children clutched their parents' hands tightly, and where strangers stared a little too long at things they should probably walk away from. At the center of the crowd stood a cage. The cage was iron, welded crudely together, its bars blackened with rust. Inside it crouched a German shepherd, large but terribly thin, bones pressing against his matted sable and silver coat. His left ear bent halfway down, a permanent scar twisting the flesh. His hind leg bore the mark of an old wound, a long raised line of white where fur refused to grow back. His muzzle, though once proud, was streaked with bald patches, and his eyes, bloodshot, burning, were alive with both rage and despair. The people around him called him only one name: Beast. Every time he lunged at the bars, snarling, the iron cage rattled like a warning bell. Children squealed. Men laughed. A few drunk farmhands tossed coins toward the cage just to watch the dog snap. They saw nothing but a dangerous animal something to gawk at, maybe to use as a guard, but never as a living creature with pain in its marrow. The owner of the dog, Roy Haskins, stood beside the cage like a showman. Roy was a broad man in his late 40s, with a belly straining against a dirty checkered shirt and suspenders that barely held him together. His face was leathery from sun and drink, cheeks red, eyes small and mean. A jagged scar stretched across his jawline, making his perpetual sneer even uglier. He had a reputation in Amarillo. People knew him as a man who fought his dogs for money, then sold the broken ones to the highest bidder. Roy lifted a hand for silence and shouted, $100! That's all! A beast that'll tear any trespasser to shreds. $100 and she's yours. Laughter rippled through the crowd. $100 for a mangy dog? It was a joke. No one here would pay half that much for a horse in its prime. But Roy was patient. He liked the attention. Liked the way the people sneered at his dog. It made the shepherd's humiliation complete. The dog inside growled low, teeth bared, eyes darting at every movement beyond the bars. He was savage, yes, but if one looked carefully, really looked, there was something else, something raw. Not violence, not hatred, but a hunger, a wound, a silent scream. That was when Ethan Cole appeared. Ethan was 35, tall but lean, the wiry strength of a man who'd spent years chasing suspects down alleyways rather than lifting weights in a gym. His short brown hair caught the sun in copper strands, his gray eyes steady even in a storm. His uniform was faded navy, the badge dulled from years of service, but his back was straight, his shoulders square. Ethan was known around Amarillo as a quiet officer, not one for bribes or idle talk. He carried a sadness about him, though few could say why. Some whispered it had to do with a case gone wrong years ago, a fellow officer killed in a robbery, and Ethan had been the one who found the body. He never spoke of it. The crowd parted as Ethan walked forward, boots stirring dust. He stopped before the cage, eyes fixed on the shepherd. For a long moment, man and dog simply stared at one another, Something shifted. The snarling slowed. The dog's ears twitched. And in those wild, bloodshot eyes, Ethan saw it clearly, the despair behind the rage, the desperate plea for mercy. Ethan took a step closer. "How much?" His voice was calm, almost too calm against the noise around him. Roy smirked, expecting mockery. "Didn't you hear, officer? $100. That's the price. But I don't reckon you want a beast like this. You're better off buying yourself a horse that won't bite your hand off." The crowd chuckled, but Ethan didn't blink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and counted out the bills. Slowly, deliberately, he set them on the crate beside Roy. The heavy slap of money silenced the laughter. "I'll take him." For a moment, the only sound was the dog's labored breathing. A man in the crowd jeered. "What's a lawman want with a devil like that? Training it for prisoners? Or maybe you want it to guard your own conscience?" More laughter followed, crueler now. Ethan's jaw tightened, but his eyes never left the shepherd's. He said only, "I don't see a beast. I see a life worth saving." There was a stillness then, a strange kind of hush that rippled through the fairground. Some scoffed, shaking their heads. Others stared at Ethan like he'd gone mad. But in the cage, the shepherd pressed forward, nose against the bars, eyes locked on the man who had just called him something he hadn't been in years worth saving. Roy shrugged, pocketed the bills, and spat into the dirt. "He's your problem now. Don't come crying when he rips your throat out." The cage door creaked open. The dog tensed, muscles coiling, lips twitching above his teeth. Ethan didn't flinch. He crouched low, hand extended, voice steady. "Easy, boy. Easy. You're coming home." The crowd held its breath. The shepherd growled, then froze. For the briefest instant he hesitated, eyes searching Ethan's face as though weighing the truth of his words. Then, with a shudder that rippled down his battered frame, the dog stepped forward, chains dragging against the dirt. The moment was fragile, but it was real. Among the bystanders was a boy, Tommy Reed, about 11 years old, skinny as a reed stalk, clothes patched from too many hand-me-downs. His blonde hair was sun-bleached, his freckles scattered like dust. Tommy was selling newspapers at the edge of the fair, his stack tucked under one arm, but he'd stopped when he saw the shepherd. He watched everything with wide, solemn eyes. Tommy had once had a mutt of his own, a brown puppy that followed him everywhere. But a drunk neighbor had kicked it one night for barking too loud. The pup never stood again. Since then, Tommy kept his distance from dogs, afraid of the reminder. Yet, when he saw the shepherd meet Ethan's gaze, something inside him stirred. He saw not just a dangerous animal, but a reflection of his own loss, his own hunger for kindness. He whispered to himself, "Don't hurt him. Please." The shepherd glanced sideways, as if he had heard, but his eyes returned to Ethan, softer now, if only by a fraction. The fairground's laughter faded into murmurs. A few shook their heads, already walking away, convinced the officer had wasted good money. Others lingered, drawn by curiosity, waiting to see if this was the moment the beast would turn and tear the man apart. Instead, Ethan clipped the leash gently onto the shepherd's collar. The dog stiffened, but he didn't bite. Together, they stepped away from the cage. Ethan straightened, his hand resting firm on the leash, guiding the trembling body beside him. The shepherd looked up once more, and though his ribs still jutted, though his scars still burned, something flickered in his gaze, something that looked almost like hope. The road back from the fairground stretched long and lonely under the dying sun. Ethan guided his truck along the cracked asphalt that cut through the outer edge of Amarillo, its tires humming low against the silence. Dust kicked up in swirls behind the rear wheels, rising like pale ghosts. In the back of the truck, the German shepherd lay stiff, chained inside a borrowed crate. His ribs showed with each shallow breath, and the weight of the day pressed heavy in his eyes. The dog had no name, not until tonight. Ethan looked back once at a red light, caught the shimmer of those haunted eyes peering through the bars, and whispered, "Shadow." The word hung in the cab, fragile but steady. He chose it not because the dog was darkness, but because it followed him like a memory-wounded, quiet, but impossible to erase. By the time Ethan pulled into his small house on the edge of town, night had fallen. The house stood plain, a one-story structure with chipped white paint and a sagging porch. The yard was little more than dry grass and a fence that had seen better years. To most, it was nothing special, but to Ethan, it was the one place untouched by the chaos of his work. He parked, cut the engine, and listened to the crickets that swelled into the silence. He carried the crate inside, setting it down in the living room. Shadow exploded against the bars immediately, snarling, his claws scraping metal. His body was all muscle and fear, coiled like a storm waiting to break. Ethan stayed calm. He knelt beside the crate, speaking in a low, measured voice. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you now." Shadow's response was a guttural growl that echoed through the quiet house. Ethan left the crate door closed, set down a bowl of water and a tin plate of food, and leaned back against the wall. He didn't push, didn't demand obedience. Instead, he spoke. His voice was steady, tired, but earnest, carrying stories like offerings across the divide of steel. He told Shadow about his own life, about growing up in Amarillo, about becoming a police officer at 22, about his best friend and partner, Officer Daniel Hayes, who'd been shot during a liquor store robbery 3 years ago. Ethan had been there, had seen Daniel fall. The guilt never left him. "People say time heals," he murmured, eyes tracing the scarred floorboards. "But some wounds, they don't close. Maybe we just learn to carry them." Shadow slammed once more against the crate, then froze. His breathing slowed, his growl tapered off, leaving only the sound of his ragged panting. He stared at Ethan with eyes that glimmered in the dim light. For the first time, the violence seemed to recede, replaced by something smaller, more fragile curiosity. Minutes turned to hours. Ethan remained in place, cross-legged on the floor, recounting fragments of memory. The night deepened. Shadow never touched the food, but his snarling quieted. His gaze never left Ethan, as though he were weighing the truth in the man's words. The house was not entirely silent. From next door came the sound of a door slamming. A porch light flickered on, and then a voice, sharp, complaining. It belonged to Alice Monroe, Ethan's neighbor. Alice was 72, a widow who lived with 2 cats that prowled her windowsills like queens. She was tall and wiry, with gray hair wound into a tight bun and sharp cheekbones that gave her the look of someone who'd never lost an argument in her life. The years had not softened her tongue. If anything, they had sharpened it. She wore thick-rimmed glasses and long skirts, and she moved with the briskness of a woman who had learned to take care of herself. Alice leaned over the fence that divided their yards, calling into the night, "Ethan Cole! What in God's name have you dragged home this time? Sounds like you've got the devil himself in there." Ethan stood, stepped onto the porch, and saw her silhouette under the weak light. "It's just a dog, Alice," he said quietly. "A dog?" She barked a laugh. "That's no dog, that's a menace. It'll tear you apart before the week's out." Her tone was cutting, but there was a tremor beneath it, the residue of old fears. Her late husband, Arthur Monroe, had been a soldier who returned from Vietnam, broken, both in body and spirit. He had once tried to tame a stray pit bull, only for it to bite him badly one night when the fireworks in town sent it into panic. Arthur had carried the scar until his death. Alice had never forgiven stray dogs for that memory, and she had never forgiven weakness either. Ethan met her eyes, calm. "He's not a menace. Just hurt." Alice shook her head, muttering as she pulled her shawl tighter. "Mark my words, Ethan. Hurt things hurt people. Don't say I didn't warn you." She vanished back inside, her cats trailing her like shadows. Back in the living room, Ethan settled once more by the crate. He continued speaking in that low, even tone. Shadow's growl had stilled entirely now. His head rested against the bars, his ears twitching with every sound Ethan made. His eyes shimmered wetly under the lamplight as if some wall inside him had cracked just a little. It wasn't trust yet. It wasn't forgiveness. But the silence of the growl was enough. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Ethan leaned his head back against the wall, eyes heavy. Shadow, still in his crate, let out a long, shuddering sigh. And though neither of them moved closer, though a gulf still yawned between man and beast, something unseen had shifted. It was the first night, and already the cage between them was less iron than it had been. The morning sun broke through the blinds in narrow strips, casting pale gold lines across the wooden floor of Ethan's living room. The house still carried the hushed tension from the night before, as if even the air itself was holding its breath. Outside, the neighborhood had begun to stir, lawn sprinklers ticking to life, a distant mower growling awake, and the bark of some dog several blocks away echoing faintly through the open window. Inside, Shadow lay still in the crate. His breathing had calmed, and the tightness in his body had loosened, if only slightly. But his eyes remained alert, flicking toward Ethan's every movement. Ethan stood in the kitchen, fixing a plain breakfast: eggs, toast, coffee. He glanced toward the crate, then reached down and slowly unlatched the door. The moment the bolt clicked, Shadow burst out. A blur of limbs and fur, his claws skittered across the floorboards. He didn't run for the door or attack. He simply darted across the room, knocked over a lamp, sent a chair spinning, and then crouched in the far corner, teeth bared, chest heaving. Ethan didn't chase him. He didn't shout. Instead, he walked quietly to the cabinet, filled a bowl with dry food, and another with water. He placed them both gently a few feet from where Shadow trembled. Then, without a word, he returned to his recliner, picked up the folded newspaper from the side table, and began to read. The newspaper rustled, the clock ticked. Shadow didn't move. An hour passed, then 2. The coffee in Ethan's cup went cold. Outside, a pickup truck rumbled by, scattering a few birds from the power lines. Shadow's breathing slowed. His tail was tucked, but his ears were no longer flat against his skull. Eventually, the smell of food proved stronger than the pull of fear. Shadow inched forward, low to the ground, belly nearly scraping the floor. His eyes stayed locked on Ethan, who turned a page and pretended not to notice. The shepherd paused inches from the bowl, sniffed, flinched, then slowly, tentatively ate. One kibble at a time, careful and quiet, like the food might disappear if he made too much noise. Ethan glanced over the edge of his paper, allowed himself the faintest smile, and went back to reading. Meanwhile, across town, in the break room of the Amarillo Police Department, conversation was louder, cruder, and far less patient. The room smelled of burnt coffee and old uniforms. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale wash across dented metal lockers and a chipped table scattered with half-eaten donuts. Among the officers, lounging with paper cups in hand, was Deputy Mark Barlow, mid-40s, barrel-chested with a shaved head and the kind of sunburned neck that told stories of years working traffic stops under the Texas heat. Mark had a booming laugh and a sharp tongue charming to some, intolerable to others. His badge was always polished, his boots always spotless, but his sense of humor often came with a side of cruelty. He leaned back in his chair, one boot kicked onto the table as he waved a hand toward his audience of 3 rookies. "So, get this," he said, grin wide. "Our golden boy, Ethan Mr. Calm and Cold, is raising himself a devil dog. Some mangy mutt from the fair. Spent $100 on it like it was a prize hog." One of the rookies, a fresh-faced kid named Nolan, laughed. "Seriously? I thought he was smarter than that." Mark nodded dramatically. "Saw the thing myself. Looks like it crawled out of a nightmare. Should be put down, not pampered. But hey, guess Ethan's bored of clean cases and sane company." They all chuckled, except for one officer, Rosalind "Roz" Vega, a sharp-eyed Latina with tied-back black hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She didn't smile. "Maybe," she said evenly, "he just sees something in that dog none of you ever bothered to look for." Mark raised a brow. "Oh, come on, Roz. Don't go poetic on me." She stood, grabbing her coffee and heading for the door. "You should be more worried about what Ethan sees in us." Back at Ethan's house, the sun had shifted past noon. Shadow now sat several feet away from Ethan, no longer hidden in corners but still tense, still coiled. The food bowl was empty, the water half gone. Shadow licked his lips, eyes flicking toward the man who had not once raised his voice, his hand, or his expectations. Ethan set his paper down and leaned forward slightly. "You got a name now," he said quietly. "Shadow. That means you're real. You belong somewhere. You belong here." The shepherd blinked once, slowly. He didn't approach, but he didn't growl. Just then, the doorbell rang. Shadow leapt up, barking deep, feral, frightened. He spun in a tight circle, unsure whether to attack or flee. Ethan moved quickly but calmly, placing himself between the dog and the door, palm out. "It's okay. Stay." Shadow froze. Not because he understood the command, but because Ethan's tone held no fear. The door creaked open to reveal Deputy Mark, still in uniform, holding a takeout bag. He raised a brow at the sight of Shadow's stiff body and Ethan's steady hand. "Well, I'll be damned," Mark drawled. "Didn't think you'd last the weekend." Ethan stepped aside just enough to keep Shadow calm. "What do you want, Mark?" "Just figured you might have burned your kitchen down trying to cook dog food. Thought I'd drop off some lunch, or maybe a muzzle." Ethan didn't react. "Appreciate the concern, but we're good." Mark peered at Shadow, who stood like a statue, eyes locked on the stranger. "That thing even let you sleep last night?" "He didn't attack me," Ethan said simply. Mark snorted. "Not yet." Without another word, he handed Ethan the bag and turned to leave. "Let me know when you need animal control." As the door shut, Ethan exhaled slowly. Shadow remained standing for another minute, muscles taut. Then, without sound, he backed up to the far wall and curled into himself. Ethan placed the bag on the counter, poured himself a glass of water, and left it there. He returned to the living room, this time sitting on the floor instead of the chair, giving Shadow space. There was no celebration, no pats or praise, just the quiet company of two broken things learning how not to break each other. The evening crept in with a restless hush, the air thick with the promise of a storm. Wind pushed through the fields outside Amarillo, kicking dust into the sky and rattling loose shingles along the neighborhood rooftops. Ethan stood on his porch, eyes turned westward as clouds rolled in, dark and low like a clenched fist. The scent of rain was in the air, metallic and cold. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Shadow lay in his usual spot near the far wall, head resting between his front paws, but his ears twitched with every gust that rattled the windows. The barometric shift wasn't lost on him. Animals always know when nature is about to roar. Ethan, still in uniform from his late shift, returned inside, closing the door against the rising wind. He glanced at Shadow, then knelt to unlace his boots. The room was lit dimly by the yellow glow of a single lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance. The first strike of lightning came 10 minutes later. A sharp flash, then a boom that shook the floorboards. Shadow shot to his feet with a bark, eyes wide, body trembling. He began pacing the room in short, panicked loops back and forth, ears flat, tail tucked, claws tapping in quick bursts against the hardwood floor. Then the second strike came. Closer. Louder. Shadow lunged toward the nearest window, crashing against it with his front paws. He let out a deep, pained bark, not of aggression, but of terror. He didn't want to attack, he wanted to escape. Ethan jumped up, moved slowly, cautiously. Hey, easy." His voice was calm, but there was a catch in it, a break he didn't bother hiding. Shadow's panic was growing, his body a coil of trauma, shaped by fists and fire and fear. Rain began to fall in sheets, hammering the roof with a relentless drumming. Shadow clawed at the window again, then at the wall, then spun in a frenzied circle. His chest rose and fell rapidly, tongue out, sides heaving. He was spiraling. Ethan dropped to his knees in the center of the room, palms facing up. His voice was a whisper now. "You're okay. I swear it. You're not back there. You're not in that cage." Shadow froze mid-step, staring at him. His lip curled briefly, but then dropped. Ethan stayed still, arms extended, his breath shallow, steady. "I'm not gonna hurt you. I never will." Outside, lightning shattered the night again. The lights flickered. Shadow jerked but didn't move toward the window. Instead, he turned slowly, eyes locked on Ethan. His legs shook. He lowered himself inch by inch, his head dipping lower than his shoulders. It wasn't submission, it was caution carved into every nerve. Then, with heartbreaking slowness, he crept forward. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. Rain streamed down the windows. Thunder echoed again. Shadow paused just a foot away. His eyes were wide, rimmed with fear, but his nose twitched toward Ethan's hand. His entire body shivered. Then, hesitating, bracing, he pressed the side of his scarred muzzle into Ethan's open palm. Ethan exhaled sharply. Not in relief, in awe. He moved his fingers just slightly, brushing the top of Shadow's head, feeling the coarse fur, the slight ridge of the bent ear, the heat of a body too used to pain. Shadow flinched but didn't pull away. He stayed there, frozen in place, eyes closed tightly as if expecting the blow to come. But it didn't. Only the gentle weight of Ethan's hand resting lightly against his skull, and just like that, a wall crumbled. Not a fortress, not completely, but a crack, wide enough for something to pass through, something small and warm, and impossible to define. Outside, near the chain-link fence at the edge of Ethan's property, a figure stood watching beneath a red hoodie that clung to his thin frame in the rain. Tommy Reed, the newspaper boy, had his bike leaned against a nearby tree. He was barely 11, with scuffed sneakers, patched jeans, and eyes too old for his age. He had returned that evening on a whim, curiosity gnawing at him ever since the fair. He'd expected to hear barking. Instead, he saw a miracle. The big dog, the one they called Beast, was trembling like a child. And Ethan, the silent cop everyone thought had a heart of stone, was whispering to him like he was cradling something broken. Tommy's eyes burned. He wiped them quickly with his sleeve and turned to go, feet splashing through puddles as he hopped onto his bike. The next afternoon, Tommy returned. This time, he had something in his hand. 2 crusts of bread and a tiny wedge of cheese wrapped in wax paper. He approached Ethan's porch shyly, unsure of what to say. Ethan opened the door before he could knock. The two locked eyes. Tommy cleared his throat. "For the dog," he mumbled. "If he's hungry." Ethan looked down at the offering, then back at the boy. He nodded. "Thanks. He might like that." Tommy didn't stay long that day, but the next day he came back, and the day after that. Each time he brought something: a heel of bread, a biscuit, half an apple. Shadow never approached him, but he watched from a distance, ears twitching, tail no longer tucked. For Ethan, it was a beginning. For Shadow, it was proof. That not all hands came with violence, that not all storms ended in terror, and for Tommy, it was hope. The first touch had changed everything. The morning air was soft and golden, the kind of light that bathed everything in forgiveness. The rain from the night before had washed the dust off the old sidewalks, and the scent of wet earth lingered along the edge of the narrow dirt paths outside Amarillo. Ethan clipped on Shadow's leash not because he didn't trust the dog, but because the world didn't yet trust them together. They walked side by side down the field road, a thin gravel path that bordered an open plain scattered with dry weeds and rusted fences. Shadow moved with quiet grace now, no longer the jittery beast that once cowered in the corner. His gait was slow but controlled, nose twitching at every shift in wind. The town had begun noticing. Whispers in the diner, glances from across gas stations. Some still crossed the street, some just stared. But Ethan didn't walk for them. He walked for Shadow. At the far end of the field sat Wheeler's grain mill, a dilapidated structure long abandoned. Across the fence line, the grassy path spilled into a small stretch of shops where locals gathered for their morning coffee and second-hand gossip. That was where it happened. The quiet broke with the sound of shattering glass. A brown bottle flew past Ethan's shoulder and exploded against the nearby fence post. Shadow froze, muscles stiff. Ethan turned. A man staggered out from the corner of the liquor store. His clothes were stained and ill-fitting, a greasy gray hoodie pulled over thinning black hair. He had the sun-wrinkled skin of someone who'd spent too many years on porches and sidewalks. In his right hand, he held another bottle. "Filthy mutt," the man shouted, slurring his words. "Should have put that thing down." Ethan stood firm. "Sir, put the bottle down and go home." The man sneered. "I seen what that dog is. People like you, bringing monsters into town." Another step forward, another bottle raised, and that's when Shadow moved. With a deep growl that rolled like distant thunder, he launched himself forward, not toward the man's throat, not with teeth bared in blind rage. No, he darted ahead of Ethan and stopped, standing squarely between his handler and the threat. His hackles raised, ears pinned, but his eyes didn't blink. The man staggered back, startled. His bravado wilted under the intense gaze of a creature that radiated control, not chaos. Ethan reached out slowly, hand hovering. "Shadow." No reaction. The dog's body was tense but not trembling. Ethan took a breath. "Sit." A pause. Then, like a miracle dressed in fur, Shadow sat, calm, still, loyal. The man cursed and stumbled away, tossing the bottle into a trash bin as he disappeared behind the corner. Silence spread like ripples through the onlookers. A few had gathered near the coffee shop's outdoor patio. An older woman with curlers in her hair gasped audibly. A teenager's mouth hung open, coffee cup frozen mid-sip. Among them stood Deputy Mark Callahan. Late 40s, solid build, short salt and pepper hair, the kind of jawline sculpted from 30 years of rule books. He had been following them from a distance that morning, not out of suspicion but habit. Mark didn't trust broken things, and he'd seen the file on Shadow, the injuries, the complaints, the price paid. But now, standing 10 feet away, he saw something else. A command given, a response without hesitation. A dog, once called beyond saving, sitting at attention like a soldier remembering his name. Mark stepped forward, boots crunching gravel, then stopped beside Ethan. He studied Shadow for a long moment. The dog didn't flinch under his gaze. Mark cleared his throat, voice low. "I used to think you were wasting your time, Rourke." Ethan didn't respond. Mark looked down again. "Maybe I was wrong." Then, softer, almost to himself, "Maybe he ain't a monster." Then he turned and walked away, nodding once to Ethan. Shadow rose as if on instinct, watching the deputy's back retreat down the path. Ethan knelt beside him. "You did good." The tail thumped once against the grass. As they turned to walk home, Tommy came biking by, slowing just enough to wave. "Hey, Mr. Rourke, that was awesome," he shouted, laughing. "Shadow's a hero." Ethan smiled, something loosening inside his chest. By the time they reached their porch, the air was warmer. The day had grown a little brighter. The air was unusually dry that evening, carrying the scent of old dust and brittle leaves rustling like whispers across Amarillo's sleepy streets. Ethan had just finished feeding Shadow, who now lay sprawled near the porch steps, eyes half-lidded but ears alert as always. Tommy had dropped by earlier with his usual bundle of breadcrumbs and a comic book to share, sitting cross-legged beside Shadow like they were two old souls waiting out the years together. Night deepened. Street lamps flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Then came the sound sharp and urgent a woman's voice screaming. Ethan jolted upright. He knew that voice. Alice. The elderly woman's home, 2 blocks down, stood alone beneath a maple tree, vines crawling up its chipped siding like fingers trying to hold it together. Alice Whitaker had lived there for nearly 4 decades. Tall, wiry, with silver hair always tied in a low bun and a permanent frown that never quite reached her eyes. She'd once been a schoolteacher, stern but fair. Age had bent her back, but not her will. After her husband passed, she became more withdrawn, often grumbling at passers-by from her porch swing. She never smiled at Shadow. She never waved at Ethan, but that didn't mean she wasn't part of the town's fragile heartbeat. From his porch, Ethan could already see the orange glow bleeding through the darkness like a wound opening in the night. Flames. He grabbed his coat, shouted back at Tommy, who had just reached the gate and bolted down the street. Shadow, without command or hesitation, was already at his side. By the time they reached the house, the fire had crawled up one wall and licked the edges of the roof. Smoke poured from the windows. Several neighbors stood frozen across the street, mouths covered, unsure whether to scream or pray. Ethan didn't stop. He kicked the door once, then twice, and it splintered open. Smoke rolled out like a living beast. The heat hit his face like a slap. "Alice!" he bellowed. No answer. He took a step inside, but the smoke curled around his neck like a noose. He coughed violently, eyes watering. Then Shadow pushed past him. "Shadow, no! Wait!" But the dog was gone, swallowed by the thick black haze. Inside, the world was a blur of firelight and chaos. Furniture crackled. Wood snapped. The ceiling above the hallway had started to bow, but Shadow moved with purpose, nose low, tail straight, guided by scent and instinct. In the living room behind a fallen shelf, Alice lay unconscious, curled on the floor like a discarded doll. Shadow found her. He nudged her shoulder, then barked once sharp, desperate. Outside, Ethan heard it. He plunged in without a second thought. On hands and knees, he crawled beneath the wave of heat. He followed the sound, the bark cutting through the haze like a flare. When he found them, Shadow was already trying to pull Alice by her sweater with gentle tugs of his jaw. Ethan heaved the shelf aside, cradled Alice in both arms, and turned. Shadow didn't follow immediately. He circled once, then barked again. Ethan looked back and saw the small, framed photo Alice always kept on her mantel, her and her husband, smiling in black and white. Shadow grabbed it between his teeth and ran. Together, they emerged through the smoke. The neighbors gasped. Tommy's phone shook in his hand as he filmed it all. Ethan, stumbling from the doorway, coughing, dragging Alice behind him and behind them. Shadow, covered in soot, clutching the picture frame like a sacred relic. Moments later, a firefighter crew finally arrived, sirens wailing too late to be heroic. They rushed in to douse the flames. Ethan laid Alice down on the grass. Her eyes fluttered open, then widened at the sight of the singed German shepherd hovering beside her. Shadow's flank had blistered slightly, patches of fur burned away, skin angry and raw. But he didn't flinch. He only watched Alice as if waiting for approval. The old woman raised a trembling hand and touched the side of his face. Tears slipped down her cheeks. "You're no monster," she whispered. "You're an angel." Tommy knelt beside them, camera still rolling. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. That night, the video spread faster than the flames had. Within hours, it lit up social media across town, then across the county. Retired killer dog saves woman from burning house. From cage to courage, Amarillo's four-legged hero. At the gas station the next morning, people greeted Ethan differently. At the diner, someone picked up his tab. At the police department, Deputy Mark printed out a still from the video Shadow standing protectively over Alice and taped it to the break room bulletin board with one word scribbled beneath: worthy. Shadow spent the day curled in his blanket beside Ethan's couch, bandages along his side. When Tommy visited with a new toy and a soft treat, Shadow lifted his head and gently wagged his tail. For the first time, the town that once feared him began to believe. And it was all because he had run toward the fire. The town had begun to change. People who once crossed the street to avoid Shadow now greeted Ethan with soft smiles and curious glances. Children waved from porches. A waitress at Dee's diner left dog biscuits on the table without being asked. Even Deputy Mark, ever skeptical, had begun nodding in approval when their paths crossed. But peace, like a sleeping storm, has a way of stirring when least expected. That afternoon, the clouds over Amarillo were low and thick, casting a gray hush over the town. Ethan was sweeping fallen leaves from the porch when Shadow lifted his head and gave a low growl, deep, steady, and unlike anything Ethan had heard since the day he brought him home. A black pickup truck rolled to a stop just outside the gate. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, and heavy-set, wearing a weathered leather jacket and jeans stained with old oil. His face was square, jaw lined with stubble, and his eyes small, cold, calculating, locked onto Shadow like a hunter sighting prey. "Ethan Carter!" the man barked, his voice thick with southern grit. Ethan straightened. "Yeah?" The man tossed a manila envelope onto the porch steps. "Name's Roy Decker. That dog, Shadow, he's mine." Ethan froze. Shadow was already on his feet, ears low, tail rigid, standing directly in front of Ethan. His eyes were locked onto Roy, not with fear, but something colder. Memory. "You got the wrong dog," Ethan said quietly, kneeling to place a hand on Shadow's back. "I got paperwork," Roy snapped, pulling out a folded, creased document from the envelope. "Adoption records, microchip scans. See? You've got my dog, and I want him back." Ethan glanced at the documents. They looked official, but something about them didn't sit right. The dates were off, the signature was just a scribble, and most of all, Shadow didn't move an inch toward Roy. If anything, his growl deepened. "You gave him up?" Ethan said. "Left him in a rusted cage behind your barn. He was starved, covered in scars. You beat him." Roy sneered. "Tough love. He was trained to guard my property. If he got soft, that ain't my fault. But now, thanks to your little internet stunt, he's famous, and I want what's mine." Ethan stepped forward, the porch creaking underfoot. "He's not yours anymore." Roy's nostrils flared. "We'll see about that." The following morning, the Amarillo Town Hall courtroom was packed tighter than Sunday service. Word had spread fast. Ethan stood before the town judge, a kind but firm woman in her 60s named Judge Margaret Howell, short silver hair, piercing eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. She had a reputation for fairness and zero patience for showboating. Roy stood smugly beside his lawyer, a slick man in a charcoal suit with 2 white teeth. Ethan stood alone, but not for long. Bam! The back doors swung open. Tommy marched in, clutching a folder in his arms. Behind him, with an oxygen tank wheeled beside her, was Alice Whitaker. Her face was paler than usual, but her eyes sparkled with defiance. "I'd like to speak, Your Honor," Alice said, voice trembling but steady. Judge Howell raised a brow. "Proceed." Alice told them everything. How she used to believe the dog was dangerous. How she'd once scolded Ethan for bringing Shadow into town. How the night her house caught fire, she would have died if that dog hadn't risked his life to save her. Tommy went next. He played the video recorded during the fire on a tablet for the court. Shadow dragging the photo from the flames. Shadow sitting calmly beside Ethan as the paramedics arrived. Shadow not a monster, but a protector. Then came the final blow. Ethan presented photos from the day he rescued Shadow, images of the emaciated dog in the cage, scars across his back, and the veterinary report dated just 2 days later, documenting malnutrition and trauma. Roy's lawyer stammered, but Judge Howell lifted a hand to silence him. "Mr. Decker," she said, voice cool and resolute, "you abandoned this animal. You failed in every duty of care, and now, when he is loved and finally safe, you come crawling back with counterfeit papers to exploit him." Roy's face flushed crimson. The judge turned to Ethan. "Mr. Carter, do you wish to retain legal guardianship of Shadow?" "I do," Ethan said firmly. Shadow sat beside him, not growling, not barking, just sitting. Eyes calm, gaze fixed on the man he now trusted more than life itself. "Then I hereby rule in favor of Mr. Carter. Shadow remains under his care and protection. Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted in soft murmurs, nods, and even scattered applause. Outside, as Roy stormed past the reporters waiting on the courthouse steps, He cast one final glance over his shoulder. Shadow met his eyes once more, but gave no snarl, no threat, only silence. Powerful, unwavering silence. Later that evening, Ethan let Shadow rest near the fire. Tommy sat nearby, drawing a cartoon version of the trial for the local paper. Alice dropped off homemade pie. Deputy Mark arrived, too, this time not to investigate, but to sit for coffee. "You did right by him," Mark said, watching Shadow curl up by Ethan's feet. "We all did." For the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to smile without caution. He reached down, ruffling the fur behind Shadow's ear. "You're home now," he whispered, "and no one's ever taking you away again." The autumn air in Amarillo had grown crisp, brushing golden over the cottonwoods and painting the hills with warm amber tones. Leaves danced across the dirt road leading to Ethan's cabin, and each sunrise brought with it the quiet promise of peace, a gift hard-earned. It had been a week since the court hearing, but its echoes lingered through the town like a hymn. Shadow, once seen as a threat, was now a silent guardian of the valley, honored by whispers, admired by children, and watched with reverence by the old souls who remembered what cruelty looked like. Ethan stood behind his cabin, hammer in hand, wood shaving stuck to his jeans, and a wide, curved smile on his face. A structure was rising next to the house, not a cage, not a kennel, but a haven. Crafted from cedar wood with a sloped roof, a porch, and windows cut low enough for a dog to look out, the space felt less like a shelter and more like a promise. Inside, there was a thick woolen rug, a custom-built bed cushioned with old army blankets, and a handmade sign that read, "Shadow's Watch." Shadow had been watching it all unfold from his usual place beneath the porch, head resting between his front paws, eyes following Ethan's every move with quiet wonder. When Ethan stepped back to admire his work, Shadow rose and padded over, his gait strong now, muscles healed and lean beneath the sable fur. One bent ear flicked as he sniffed the new shelter, then stepped inside slowly, turning a circle, then lying down. A long exhale. He was home. Later that afternoon, Tommy pedaled up the gravel path on his rusted red bike, backpack bouncing against his shoulders. His cheeks were red from the wind, and he had 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil sticking out of his side pocket. "Brought lunch," he declared, dropping the bike against the fence. Ethan grinned. "You're going to spoil this dog more than I do." Tommy was growing fast, his sneakers now too small, his voice inching into new tones. He sat cross-legged near Shadow's new shelter, unwrapping one sandwich and holding it gently out. Shadow sniffed it, then took it with careful jaws, his tail tapping once. "You know," Tommy said after a moment, brushing crumbs from his lap, "I've been thinking about being a canine cop, like when I'm older." Ethan, seated nearby on an overturned crate, nodded thoughtfully. "It's a good path, but it's not easy. Takes patience, discipline, and heart." Tommy looked at Shadow, who now lay half in, half out of his shelter, eyes closed, sun warming his fur. "I got plenty of heart," he said confidently, "and I want a partner like Shadow, one who doesn't give up, even when people are mean to him." There was a beat of silence, gentle, and then Ethan said softly, "You'll make a fine one, kid. Just don't forget the most important part." "What's that?" "To earn your dog's trust. That's something no badge can give you." The following day, Alice Whitaker paid a visit. She arrived in a beige cardigan, her thinning gray hair swept up neatly, and a woven basket of biscuits tucked under her arm. Age had not dulled her grace, nor the sharp glint in her eyes. "I come bearing treats," she announced, "for the dog, not the man." Ethan chuckled and stepped aside to let her pass. She approached the shelter and stood quietly before Shadow, who rose to his feet and met her gaze. She extended a hand. He sniffed it, then licked her fingers gently. "Well," she whispered, a tear rising behind her glasses, "ain't you just the keeper of this little valley now?" Ethan watched as Shadow rested his head gently on her knee, his tail wagging once, slow and measured. The old woman wiped at her eye, muttering, "Just something in the wind." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant ridges, casting a golden glow across the grass, Ethan sat on the steps of his cabin, legs stretched, coffee in hand. Shadow lay beside him, head resting on Ethan's boot, eyes half closed but still alert. "You remember the first day?" Ethan murmured. Shadow lifted his head slightly. "You were all bones and rage. People called you Beast. They saw the scars, not the soul." The dog didn't move, but his eyes were steady calm, understanding. "You're not that anymore," Ethan said quietly. "You're not a weapon, not a mistake, you're family." Shadow responded by shifting closer and placing his head gently on Ethan's open palm. It was not a gesture of submission, but of trust, deep and quiet. Ethan let the moment settle. In the distance, laughter echoed from town. Somewhere a dog barked. A train whistle moaned. Life, in all its flawed beauty, kept moving forward. But here, at the edge of Amarillo, beneath a sky turning violet, a man and his dog, both once broken, both once unwanted, had found something rare. A home not built of bricks, but of second chances. A bond not born of ownership, but of choice. And in the hush between the breeze and the stars, Ethan whispered one last thing. "Thank you for choosing me." Shadow did not reply, but the way he leaned in, warm and whole, that was answer enough. Sometimes miracles don't come with thunder or angels in the sky. Sometimes they come in the form of a scarred old dog lying quietly on your porch, waiting to be loved again. Shadow wasn't just a rescued dog. He was a reminder that no creature, man, or animal is beyond redemption, that even the most wounded souls can become protectors, and even the loneliest hearts can find a home. God works through the silent, the broken, and the forgotten. He sends comfort not always in riches, but in second chances, loyal companions, and unexpected friendships. So, if you are watching this today and feel like you've been overlooked or abandoned, remember, your story is not over. Your shadow may be just around the corner. All it takes is a little faith and an open heart. If this story touched your heart, type Amen in the comments. Share your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed a small miracle? Tag someone who needs this message. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, faith, and second chances. May God bless everyone watching this, and may He send you your own miracle in a form you never expected.
He stood on the edge like he understood what was beneath him. A German Shepherd puppy, barely 5 months old, trembling on the lip of the Little Colorado River Bridge in Arizona, his paws curled around the concrete ledge as if it were the only thing holding him to this world. Wind ripped through the canyon and sent flecks of dust and fur spiraling into the sunlit air. Cars slowed, phones were raised, fingers pointed, but no one moved. His coat, black and tan, clung in tufts to his ribs, and one ear was folded strangely, like it had never stood upright, but it was his eyes that stopped me cold. Wide, wild, locked onto nothing. I was 10 seconds too late. The puppy slipped. I don't remember throwing the door of my Jeep shut, don't remember yelling, don't remember the scream from the woman standing closest to him, just the thunder of my boots on pavement and my own voice inside my skull saying, "He's gone." But he wasn't. I reached the railing just in time to see his tiny form caught, miraculously, on a mossy ledge of the support column, 15 feet below. He was wedged awkwardly between a chunk of broken concrete and the slick vertical face of the pillar. One wrong move and the river below would swallow him. I gripped the metal rail so hard it burned. Tourists around me gasped and murmured. Some already turned away, shaking their heads like the ending was written. But I saw something different. That pup, he wasn't trying to jump. He was trying to hold on. His back legs slipped and his body twitched violently to stay in place. He didn't give up, and I sure as hell wasn't going to either. My name is Ethan Ward. I'm a 43-year-old ranger here in Grand Canyon National Park. And that day, I made a decision that had nothing to do with training, protocol, or common sense. I yanked off my utility jacket, tossed my radio to the asphalt, and began climbing over the rail. Someone shouted at me not to do it, but I couldn't look away from him. That German Shepherd puppy was still alive, and I was going to reach him. The metal burned hot under my palms as I swung one leg over the rail. Wind pushed against me like it knew what I was about to do and wanted to stop me. The support pillar was old, its concrete worn and slick from years of rain and sun, but I didn't care. That German Shepherd puppy was clinging to a ledge no wider than my hand, and his body was starting to shake harder. I could hear the river below now, angrier, louder. The Little Colorado wasn't deep here, but it was fast and violent. One slip, and he'd be gone. I've seen what that water does to full-grown elk. A puppy wouldn't stand a chance. Voices behind me rose, panicked, confused. "Sir, stop! It's not worth it! It's just a dog!" I tuned them out. I lowered myself onto the outer lip of the bridge, finding footing on a narrow beam, and started inching sideways toward the pillar. The heat from the concrete soaked through my shirt. My fingers scraped against the wall, finding any crevice to hold on. I couldn't afford to look down. The closer I got, the clearer I could see him. He was smaller than I thought. Maybe 25 pounds. One paw hung limp, dangling over the edge. His tongue lolled sideways, and his ribs rose and fell so fast it scared me. But his eyes, those eyes never blinked. They were fixed on me, like he'd already chosen me as his last hope. The final few feet were the worst. There was no proper foothold, just a rusted bolt where a maintenance railing used to be. I jammed my boot against it and leaned out, stretching one arm toward him. He flinched and barked, a sharp, desperate sound that hit something deep inside me. "Easy," I whispered. "I'm right here, buddy." My fingers brushed his paw. Slippery, wet, he started to slide. Without thinking, I lunged. My hand caught the scruff of his neck. His body twisted violently in the air, and for a second I felt his weight shift against gravity. But I held on, with both hands now. His claws scratched against the pillar, searching for something, anything to grab. I braced my knees against the concrete and pulled. That German Shepherd puppy locked his jaw around my sleeve like it was his last anchor on earth. And suddenly, we weren't strangers anymore. His teeth clamped onto my sleeve with a force I didn't expect from something so small. I felt the tug straight through my arm as his body dangled midair, legs thrashing against the void. For a split second, I thought the fabric would tear, that I'd watch him fall, helpless. But the canvas held, and I wasn't letting go. Not of him. I twisted my body, grinding my boots against the pillar, anchoring my shoulder into the concrete. Bit by bit, I hoisted him upward, inch by inch, like dragging a rope through mud. His hind legs found the ledge again, barely, but his front paws scrambled wildly. He didn't understand. He just knew he wanted to live. "You're okay?" I grunted. "I've got you." The sun beat down on both of us, sweat pouring into my eyes. I finally got one arm around his chest and pulled him into my torso. He let go of my sleeve, breathing like he'd just run a marathon. I could feel his heart hammering through his ribs, as if it were trying to escape his body. His head pressed against my chin, hot and trembling. For a second, we just stayed there, me wedged against a vertical wall with 30 feet of air below, and a German Shepherd puppy collapsed in my arms like a child too tired. Then came the part I hadn't thought through. Getting back up. The ledge was too narrow for both of us. I couldn't climb with one arm and hold him with the other, not without risking a fall for both of us. But every time I tried to set him down, even for a second, he whimpered and dug his claws into me. He didn't trust gravity anymore. Can't blame him. I adjusted my grip and shouted toward the bridge. "Rope! Someone get me a rope!" There was movement up top. A man ran to his truck. A woman knelt at the edge, filming with her phone. I looked up and met her eyes. She wasn't crying, just watching. The puppy groaned, shifting his weight closer to my chest, and I realized then how thin he was. His ribs were more prominent than any stray I'd seen in years. His paws were raw, and around his neck, beneath the fur, something glinted. A frayed piece of orange nylon. The end of a rope. He hadn't wandered up there. Someone tied him and left him to die. The rage hit me so fast it made my hands shake. That knot around his neck wasn't random. It had been tied by human fingers. Deliberate, tight. The frayed end looked torn, as if he'd struggled against it until it snapped. Someone had brought this German Shepherd puppy to the edge of a canyon, tied him up, and walked away. Left him to starve, to fall, or to be forgotten. But he hadn't given up, and neither would I. Above, someone shouted. They'd found a rope. I heard footsteps, quick instructions. Moments later, a thick orange line dropped beside me, smacking against the pillar and swinging like a pendulum. I grabbed it with one hand, looped it under the pup's chest, tied it fast. "Pull him up first," I yelled. Voices echoed above. The rope went taut, then began to lift. The puppy, still pressed against me, let out a low whine as he rose. He didn't struggle, didn't panic. He just stared down at me, and I swear I saw something in those eyes. Not fear, not confusion. Gratitude. His little body disappeared over the bridge edge, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. My arms were numb. My knees bled from grinding into the concrete, but I wasn't done yet. Another rope dropped. I looped it around my chest and signaled. Hands gripped and pulled. The ascent was slower for me. My boots scraped against the wall, my shoulder screamed from the strain. But when I finally crested the edge and someone grabbed my arm, the light hit my face and the crowd broke into scattered applause. It felt hollow, because most of them hadn't moved when he was falling. They'd watched, filmed. One man clapped me on the back and laughed. "Hell of a show, man. That dog's got some luck." I turned and saw the puppy, lying on his side, chest rising and falling like a broken bellows. His eyes tracked me as I approached. He didn't move, didn't even lift his head, but his tail tapped once, just once, against the asphalt. That was for me. A woman nearby muttered, "It's just a dog. You could have gotten killed." I looked at her, then back down at him. He wasn't just anything. He was still alive, still fighting, and he'd just proven he mattered. He lay against my leg like he'd known me forever. That German Shepherd puppy, barely 5 months old, skin and bone, his paws torn raw, pressed his head into my boot like it was the only solid thing left in the world. I crouched beside him, ran a hand gently over his ribs, and felt the ridges of every bone beneath his fur. He didn't flinch. He just let me touch him, like he'd decided, somewhere during that fall, to trust me completely. Around his neck, the frayed nylon rope still clung like a scar. I pulled out my pocket knife and cut it free. He blinked slowly, almost like a sigh. There was something heartbreaking about that moment, as if he knew what it meant, as if the weight of that rope had always been more than just physical. I scooped him into my arms, careful not to jar his legs. He didn't resist, just melted into me. People parted as I carried him back toward my Jeep, some filming, others pretending they hadn't just stood by and watched him almost die. A young girl stepped forward, maybe 8 or 9. Her hands were clutching a tourist map, and her eyes were locked on the puppy. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Yeah, he's a fighter." She smiled, then did something that nearly broke me. She reached out and gently touched his paw. He didn't pull away. Back at my Jeep, I spread out an old canvas blanket from the back seat and laid him down. He curled instantly, tucking his nose under his tail, but kept one eye on me, just one, as if to say, "Don't leave me." "I'm not going anywhere, Atlas," I said. I don't know why I called him that. It just came out. Maybe it was the way he carried that moment, like he'd held the weight of something enormous on those trembling shoulders, like he'd survived what no puppy should ever have to survive. Atlas? It fit. I reached under the seat, pulled out my emergency water jug, and poured a little into my palm. He sniffed it, then licked slowly, weakly, but with purpose. As he drank, I noticed something else. A thin scar along his hind leg, half healed. Not fresh, not new. Which meant the bridge wasn't the beginning of his story. Someone had tried to break him before and failed. Atlas was still here, still breathing, and I was going to find out who had thrown him away like a thing. But first, I was going to make sure he knew he was never going back. The sky was blazing clear as I drove south toward my ranch. Atlas lay curled in the passenger seat, wrapped in the canvas blanket, eyes barely open but watching every turn of the road like it mattered. He didn't whimper, didn't move much, just breathed in quiet, measured rhythms, like he didn't quite believe he was safe yet. Every bump in the road made me flinch. I glanced down at him more than I watched the road. His body was so light, I kept checking to make sure he was still breathing. His fur smelled like dust and river water and something else. Something old, like a place forgotten. We passed the trailhead turnout, then the overlook, then a line of shops at the edge of town. I pulled into the REI store on instinct. It was dumb, maybe, but I couldn't bring him home empty-handed. Inside, the air conditioning hit like a wall. I moved fast, grabbed a dog sleeping bag, a thermal blanket, one of those padded folding beds they market for outdoor adventures with pets. I tossed in a collapsible bowl and a pair of little booties I knew he probably wouldn't tolerate. The cashier was a tall kid with a name tag that said Joey and a face full of freckles. "Camping with your dog?" he asked, grinning. I hesitated, then nodded. "Something like that." He scanned the sleeping bag and looked out the window toward the Jeep. "That pup's a fighter." I stopped. "How'd you know?" Joey shrugged. "I saw the video. He was on the bridge, right? That was you?" Of course it was already online. I just nodded. He leaned in a little, his voice softer. "Hey man, thanks for going back for him. Most wouldn't." I swallowed that down and left before I had to answer. Back in the car, I laid the new sleeping bag across the back seat and lifted Atlas gently onto it. He didn't resist, just shifted once to press his head into the corner of the fabric, and for the first time I saw his body relax. The sun angled lower as we pulled into the gravel driveway of my ranch. It wasn't much, a small house, a barn I didn't use, an old windmill that creaked in the breeze, but it was quiet, safe. Atlas raised his head as we rolled to a stop. "Home," I said, more to myself than him. I carried him inside and laid him near the fireplace. The warmth must have comforted him, because he gave the smallest sound, a kind of breathy sigh, and closed his eyes. And in that stillness, in that little moment of peace, something hit me. That German Shepherd puppy had fought for his life on a bridge where no one helped him. He didn't cry out for attention. He didn't panic. He held on. Now it was my turn to hold on for him. It was the sound that woke me. A low, trembling whine, not loud, not panicked, but enough to pierce through the quiet of my house and pull me off the couch in the dark. The fire had burned low. Shadows danced along the wooden walls. I followed the noise, barefoot, heart thudding. Atlas wasn't asleep anymore. He was standing, or trying to, legs stiff, tail low, staring at the front door. His ears were pinned back, and that sound, kept leaking from his throat like a memory he couldn't shake. I crouched beside him, laid a hand gently on his shoulder. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe now." He didn't look at me, just kept staring ahead. Not at the door, through it, like he was waiting for someone. Then it hit me. He wasn't just scared, he was searching. And dogs don't search for nothing. My breath caught as I remembered the nylon rope, the frayed end, how it hadn't looked like a leash, but something makeshift, like someone had tied two things together and only one broke free. "Were you alone up there?" I whispered. "Or did someone leave you? Both?" Atlas let out a whimper and pawed at the door, once, then twice. Weak but deliberate. I opened it. Cool desert air swept in, carrying the scent of juniper and dust. Atlas stepped forward, legs shaky, nose twitching furiously as he sniffed the wind. Then, without warning, he turned and looked straight at me. That look, it wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was a question. Something in my chest clenched hard. I grabbed my boots, keys, and a flashlight and gently helped him into the passenger seat again. His head immediately pressed to the window, nose working the seams of the glass like he was tracking ghosts. We drove in silence, back through the sleeping roads of town, headlights cutting across the sand. The bridge loomed ahead, still wrapped in yellow tape from the rescue. The canyon was quiet now, still. I parked. Atlas stiffened. He began to whine again, higher this time, more urgent. Then he pushed at the door with his paw. I let him out, and he stumbled forward, nose to the ground, pulling me with surprising force toward the slope that led beneath the bridge. We moved slow, the beam of my flashlight bouncing across rocks and thorn brush. Every few feet, he'd pause, sniff, then continue, faster now, as if some invisible thread was tightening. And then he stopped cold, ears perked, breath frozen. Somewhere in the brush ahead, a soft rustle, then a sound that shattered me. A second whine, thin, hoarse, and unmistakably young. Atlas turned to me, eyes wide. He had never been alone. I dropped to my knees so fast the flashlight flew from my hand. Atlas stood rigid beside me, his nose locked in one direction, every muscle in his small frame trembling with alertness. His tail didn't wag. He didn't move. He just stared into the brush like his heart was tethered to something inside it. And then, barely audible over the wind, came the sound again. A weak, broken cry, high-pitched and fading. Not loud enough to call for help, just enough to say, "I'm still here." I crawled forward, pushing aside thorny branches that scratched across my forearms. My flashlight rolled in the dirt behind me, its beam casting wild shadows. Atlas stayed back, but he let out a low, urgent bark that cracked halfway through, and then I saw her. Curled beneath a juniper bush, wedged between rocks, was another German Shepherd puppy. Same age, same black and tan coat, same frightened eyes. She was smaller than Atlas, thinner, her ribs sharper under the skin. One paw was bent at an unnatural angle. She didn't lift her head. She didn't have the strength. Oh my God, I breathed. Nova. I don't know why that name came to me. Maybe because she looked like the fading light of a dying star. Fragile, beautiful, barely holding on. But when I whispered it aloud, Nova, her ears twitched. Atlas whimpered behind me. I moved slowly, gently sliding my hands beneath her tiny frame. She didn't resist, didn't even react. Her eyes stayed half-lidded, her breath shallow. I could feel how cold her body was, how close she was to slipping away. I wrapped her in my flannel overshirt and turned to Atlas. He approached in slow steps, then stopped just inches from her. He sniffed her face, then her ears, then did something that stopped my heart. He laid down beside her and pressed his body to hers. He didn't move after that, didn't bark, didn't nudge, just gave her his warmth, as if he remembered exactly what it felt like to be on the edge, to hang between survival and surrender, and now he was saying, "I'm here. Don't let go." I cradled them both in my arms and carried them up the hill, one step at a time, tears blurring my vision. The stars above us were scattered like promises. At the Jeep, I wrapped Nova tighter, turned the heat up full blast, and settled her into the back seat beside her brother. Atlas rested his chin on her side, his eyes never leaving hers. She blinked, just once, but it was enough to say she was still fighting, and enough to tell me I wasn't done saving them yet. I drove like the road didn't matter. Every mile between the canyon and my ranch felt like a thread pulling tighter. Nova lay curled on the back seat, her body barely rising with each breath. Atlas wouldn't leave her side. Not for water, not for treats, not even when I called his name. His nose stayed pressed to her fur, as if he believed his warmth alone could anchor her here. The vet clinic in town was closed. It was after midnight, so I did the only thing I could. I took them home. The second we got inside, I cleared a space near the fireplace, laid down the padded sleeping bag from REI, and gently unwrapped Nova from my shirt. Her eyes fluttered. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to cry out, but no sound came. Atlas curled around her again. I knelt beside them with a bowl of warm broth I'd thrown together in a panic. Chicken stock, rice, bits of boiled carrot. Atlas licked at it slowly. Nova didn't move. My hands shook as I dipped my fingers into the bowl and touched a drop to her lips. Nothing. I tried again. A flicker. Her tongue moved, barely. I kept going, drop by drop, minute by minute. Atlas licked her ear softly, then rested his head over her neck. His eyes didn't leave mine. Help her. That's what they said. And I was trying. God, I was trying. I grabbed a space heater from the closet, set it beside them, then threw on another blanket. The room filled with low, steady warmth. I stayed up all night, watching her chest rise and fall. Around 3 a.m., she had a seizure. A small one. Her legs twitched, her jaw locked. Atlas jumped up and barked, sharp and desperate, and I cradled her head in my hands, whispering anything that came to mind. When it passed, she was limp. I thought that was it, but Atlas didn't accept it. He licked her paws, nudged her side, made this high, broken sound that I'd never heard from a dog before. And maybe it was that sound, maybe it was her brother's voice that pulled her back. Because a minute later, Nova took a sharp, shallow breath, and then another. And then she moved, just enough to shift against him. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, hand frozen in midair, afraid that if I moved, I'd break the moment. Atlas gave a single wag of his tail. That German Shepherd puppy had just pulled his sister back from the edge. And in that instant, I knew he hadn't survived just for himself. He had survived to find her. The room was silent, except for the sound of breath returning. Nova's chest rose in shallow, unsteady rhythm, but it was rising. Her eyes didn't open and her limbs were still, but there was color returning to her gums, a faint twitch in her paw when Atlas nudged her gently. I sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the two of them, unable to move, afraid to break the fragile thread holding her here. Then, her breathing changed. It stuttered, paused. I leaned in fast, fingers pressed to her ribs. Her lungs were working harder now, pulling for air like her body had just remembered how. But it wasn't enough. Her head lolled sideways, and that breath, God, that awful, shivering breath, caught and didn't release. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." Atlas stood, tail low, pawing at her side. I scooped her up, wrapped her in a blanket, and ran to the gear cabinet by the door. I'd bought an emergency oxygen kit last summer. A tourist had collapsed from heat stroke on the South Rim, and I wasn't about to be caught unprepared again. I fumbled with the valve, my fingers numb, twisted the regulator until the tank hissed and gave life. I cupped the mask over Nova's nose and mouth. Her body was limp, so still it felt wrong in my arms. "Come on," I whispered. "Come on, baby girl." Atlas climbed up beside us, nudging at her shoulder, licking the side of her face with soft, frantic movements. I didn't stop him. I let him be part of it. He deserved to be part of it. Time warped. 10 seconds or 10 years, I couldn't tell you. Then her chest jerked once, a sharp inhale, another. She let out the faintest sound, a rasp that barely made it past her throat, but her body twitched against mine. Her eyes fluttered open, just for a second, and focused on nothing, but they opened. I exhaled so hard I almost fell forward. "She's breathing," I said aloud. "She's breathing, Atlas." The puppy pressed his nose into her neck and whimpered softly, like he'd just been given permission to feel again. I sat on the floor, holding her like a newborn, the oxygen hissing quietly, the fire behind us casting gold across their fur. Atlas didn't lie down. He stayed upright, still touching her, still watching, as if guarding the boundary between life and loss. And somewhere in the stillness of that hour, I realized something I hadn't dared name before. He hadn't just survived the fall, he'd waited for her, he'd held on for her. And tonight she had come back, because of him. Morning light crept through the windows like a promise. Nova was asleep, this time not from weakness, but from rest. Her breathing was slow, steady. The oxygen mask had slipped to the side, but she no longer needed it. Her head rested in the curve of Atlas's chest, and his paw lay protectively across her back. I watched them like someone watching a miracle unfold in real time. After everything they'd been through, the fall, the cold, the hunger, the silence, they had made it, together. Atlas looked different now. He wasn't trembling. His body had filled out slightly over the last few days, thanks to real food and sleep, but it was more than that. It was in his eyes. That cautious fear had faded, replaced by something quiet and rooted, something like belonging. He hadn't left her side since we found her. Not for a moment. It was early afternoon when I heard tires on gravel. The family from Flagstaff had arrived. They were clients I'd guided once on a backcountry hike, a couple with 2 kids, both under 10. When they saw the rescue video online and recognized my name, they reached out through a ranger contact and asked if they could meet the puppies. Just meet. No pressure. I wasn't sure how I felt about it until they stepped out of the car. The little boy walked straight to Atlas, knelt in the grass, and said nothing. Just held out his hand. Atlas stared for a moment, then patted over and rested his chin in the boy's palm. The girl, maybe 6, sat cross-legged near Nova's blanket. Nova, still weak but alert, lifted her head. The girl didn't squeal, didn't reach out. She just started humming, soft and aimless. Nova wagged her tail. It was the first time I'd seen her do that. The parents watched from a respectful distance, eyes shining. I didn't say much. I didn't have to. The bond was already there. We stayed outside for an hour, the sun warm, the world slow and gentle. Atlas chased a leaf once. Nova followed a few steps behind, limping slightly but determined. The kids laughed, ran, circled back again and again. It wasn't hard to see it. They belonged to each other. Later, as the family packed the car, the dad turned to me. "We can take them both, if you think it's right." I looked at Atlas. He was watching me with that same steady gaze, the one I'd first seen on the bridge, the look of someone who understands more than he should. "You okay with this?" I asked. He stepped forward and pressed his head into my thigh. That was all the answer I needed. I helped lift Nova into the back seat, then turned to Atlas. He leapt up on his own and lay down beside her, their bodies curling in the same mirrored shape they'd held that first night by the fire. The kids buckled in. The engine started. And just before the car pulled away, Atlas turned his head to the window and met my eyes one last time. Not with sadness, with trust, like he knew the world wasn't such a cruel place after all. I still think about them, Atlas and Nova, every time I drive over that bridge. I glance down at the water, the jagged rocks, the support pillar where he held on. I remember the silence before the fall, the helplessness, the way the world just kept spinning while a German Shepherd puppy clung to life alone. And I remember how that same puppy refused to let go, not of the ledge and not of hope. He didn't just survive, he endured so he could find her. Nova survived because Atlas believed she was still out there, and she fought her way back because someone cared enough to look. Their bond saved them both, but it only had a chance because someone stepped in. That's the part I can't shake. It wasn't grand. It wasn't scripted. It was one decision in one moment. Don't turn away. Do something. I didn't change the world, but I changed theirs. And that's what rescue really means. It's not just about saving animals. It's about what they show us in return. Resilience, loyalty, forgiveness. That even after abandonment, pain, and silence, they're still willing to trust again. Still willing to love. Atlas and Nova now live in Flagstaff in a home filled with laughter, crayons, backyard sprinklers, and bedtime cuddles. I get photos every month. 2 growing German Shepherds curled beside 2 growing children. They're not just pets, they're guardians, healers, family. And when I see their eyes in those pictures, I don't see the canyon anymore. I see everything that came after. This little guy's journey from abandonment to rehabilitation shows how important nonprofit rescue groups really are. Caring for a rescued puppy is more than love, it's responsibility, it's pet care. Every share, every comment, every voice helps make sure dogs like Atlas and Nova aren't left behind again. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share. Your support helps bring the next puppy home. Join our Brave Paws family. Be their voice, be their hope.